Hello and welcome to this Total Education media lecture. Tonight, as you probably worked out from the start of this lecture and the little scene we had at the beginning, that we're talking about Second Spring. We're looking at Alistair MacLeod's short stories again. Tonight, the Second Spring. Second Spring's about a boy, cattle and his eventual growing up, but it's more than that, isn't it? It's about a lot of different things and how life is a combination of learning and growing and developing. And we look at this story and we look at some of the global and outside influences that affect the family and their lives. In my notes here I've written, it's a simple, innocent intrusion of the outside world into a closed farming life, and it creates a memorable incident that becomes relatively benign with the passage of time. I think that's a nice way to sort of analyse that story down into a short sentence or phrase. And it's about the cyclical nature of life, and we know that MacLeod talks about the island and how happy life can be on the island, but also how harsh and cruel, and this story combines both those things as well. The life on the farm is chronicled in many ways, in nearly like a recount fashion. And we talk about the seasons and how life changes and adapts with each season. And I think he suggests in that the cyclical nature of life is not just about the animals, but it's about us and the island and the seasons and all those elements that MacLeod brings into his stories, and that's what makes them so great. He understands Cape Breton very well. He understands the island, he understands the farming life, and he's really empathic with those characters. What else have we got? Of course, this is about birth and death, and the main theme that runs through the story, or the purpose of the story, is probably the explanation of the boy growing up and passing through a specific cycle of his own life. But the purpose is also to explain to us about life and death and how natural those things are in the general cycle of the world around us. And that's really a constant. You know, the sun comes up, the sun goes down, the farming life goes on. And I think it's very important. The intrusions to the family life are very disruptive to it in many ways, and they seem unwelcome at times, and the family has its own cycle as it moves. And I think we first see this when we look at the intrusion of the livestock buyers on page 222. And I think that on that page 222 we have a very specific incident. And I'll read you that little incident where the livestock buyers come, because it's the trucks that come. And the father says, "Livestock buyers came, sometimes walking into the pasture to view their intended victims, offering prices, quoting possibilities, leaving and returning." And it's a very cyclical thing, isn't it? They come at a particular time of the year, they go at a particular time of the year, and of course that cycle continues year after year, because some years there's lots to take away, some years there's not so many to take away, and that's explained very well. Why does he describe the butchery in detail? And that's a question that many readers have asked over the years, and certainly students have questioned, because it is very graphic. And I think the way I read the story is it's that normal, it's just part of life, it's normalcy, but it's also that child's inquisitiveness. And a child's perspective is very different to an adult's, and we grow up and we look at life and living and death in different ways. But for children it's just a thing that happens, and it's very, very important that they learn from this and inquire. And the father shows them, he teaches them, he shows them the organs, and it's all very graphic. But it certainly is part about the natural cycle and the balance of life. And I think the best quote is the one on page 226 that sums this one up. And I will read you that quote because I think it's at the core of this story and part of the element of it. "Such scenes of selling and butchering would repeat themselves until a rough balance between livestock and available hay was achieved. In dry seasons, when the hay crop was less lush, there would have to be a corresponding reduction in animal numbers. In the years that were more bountiful, we could afford to winter individuals who would not have survived the more rigorous selectivity of the leaner years." And I think that balance that he talks about there, the balance is part of life, and we need to learn that balance for ourselves as we develop and grow as individuals. And it's just a big wide picture of that. The outsider comes, and the outsider, or the representative of the outside world or the global, or however you want to describe it, the intruder into their lives, is this time the agricultural representative who makes a huge impression on the young boy and the narrator, and he says he's eager and energetic, and he's able to empower the children, I suppose in a modern term, to go out and do things. The father's very cynical about the agricultural representative, and we see this on page 229, and you'll need to look that quote up for yourselves. And I think he's very cynical because he's done the whole process before, and he's even held a bull on his own farm and helped other farmers and been paid to do it, impregnate their cows, and it never really worked for him. He finds it an intrusion, he didn't like it. But he doesn't say no to his son, and I think that's very important. And the son works, and his father eventually acquiesces. And because he knows that he needs to find out for himself, and you learn by doing, and I think that's the important thing here. Morag, the cow, is very important in the story in many ways, and as livestock is central to their own existence and futures and past. But unfortunately, as he takes Morag to become impregnated by the official bull, the purebred, what happens is another bull intercedes, and he gets saved sort of by his cousin, who knocks the bull out with a giant bowling ball of stone. And they take the cow to be impregnated by the official bull, but it doesn't work, of course, and she's already been impregnated and is pregnant to the sort of feral type cow. And that journey in itself, where he leaves with the Morag, and he has all these expectations on the journey, and really none of them are met. And that's about life in many ways, and it's like a microcosm for our lives, where our expectations sometimes are met, sometimes they're not. Strange events happen, and it ends up in balance, and he arrives home safely but exhausted. And I think the journey is certainly not what he expected, but MacLeod doesn't say that in obvious terms. What he does is he goes back and he makes an allusion to the Gothic and the Romantic, and in a wonderful, wonderful piece of writing, which I will read, he talks about this journey on page 239. And he says, in romantic retrospect, I see myself sometimes as one of those guides in the Gothic novels, attempting to guard my tremulous female figure from the lascivious, slobbering male who, in fulfilling of his desires, will cause irrevocable pain. Or, by another extension, the concerned father, who will do almost anything to keep his vulnerable daughter from the one he knows to be not right for her. Defence against the figure with but one thing on his mind. And that certainly is the bull and represents the bull. And I think that allusion to literature shows not only a brilliant piece of writing, of course, but it's an awakening to a broader world. And I think, obviously, NRA is very educated and understands what's going on. And it's looking back in life on different ways and things, and that passage is wonderful, and there's sort of allusions are in several of the stories. So what is it? We know what happens. The calf's a bastard, certainly not anything out of the standard breeds, but things move on. He moves on to a different thing, and Second Spring's all about that regrowth and rebirth and regeneration, isn't it? He moves on to baseball, where he certainly has more sense of control, and we read that wonderful last sentence. He's grown up, he's self-assured. The story is about waiting and patience and how the cycle will go, but you need to really look at that last paragraph, and especially that last sentence. And I'll just read that sentence to you before I move on to discuss the language and the other techniques. In my small area of the earth, it seemed that everything was under my control. And I think that's development and partly growing up, isn't it? And certainly the boy's moved on, and this huge incident that was so important to him is now longer not so important. And that's a wonderful way of discussing and describing life, and that sort of thing could be said anywhere. It's just that so happens that MacLeod's set it on Cape Breton and is so sensitive, and it's set in that agricultural way and the way of life, and it really is a big event in those small farming lives. So what is MacLeod really conveying in this story? What is he trying to get across in the sense of the global or issues that the universal? I think the outside world or the bigger world is small to a child. I think the cycle of life certainly goes on with and despite intrusions, and we do, the cycle moves on, and I've written here in my notes, you can't force nature. And I think that's trying to change nature is a sort of, some of these people come and the outside world sort of intrudes on the natural cycle, and they try and force things, and it can't be done. And I think McLeod points out that nature is a force in itself, and you shouldn't be trying to shape it necessarily and change it in many ways, because it will shape and change you. And I think the families on the island have achieved that balance, and intrusions from the outside world upset that balance in some way. Life too, at the end, as we see in those final paragraphs, is about having some control of our own lives, a sense of destiny in our own fate, and the way that we're going to move through life. And I think that sense of control is very important, and we see the child's weakness when the ball comes and he just doesn't know what to do, and he's not physically capable of doing anything. And I think that loss of control and that lack of sense of control is probably the moment we feel most for him, because he's worked himself up to want such a wonderful thing in a wonderful place, and to do such a great thing as he sees it, and yet it's all destroyed in one spectacular moment. What else is there in the story? Life, that he forgets about it when he moves on to something new. Baseball becomes the most important thing in his life, and we know that. We move on, we do different things, and isn't that the sense of adaptation and ability to change is so important? And I think they're the two key words that we've focused on looking at Ireland and some of the other things in this study, is that the individual's ability to adapt and change is so important. And I think in a child, more so than an adult, moving on is so much easier. What else is there? As we grow, we must learn from our contact with the outside world, and we must learn from the experiences that we have in that outside world. And I think that's very, very important. The idea of learning from the experiences that he has. And we see in the reflection and the way he looks back on the scene that it is a learning experience for him. And I think that's what McLeod makes so important. So what literal techniques do we have here? It's certainly a reflective story with a retrospective quality. It doesn't seem to me to be so melancholic as some of his other stories. It's just a reflection, and I don't think it's a learning process rather than this is a sad, or it certainly doesn't have that darker tone of some of the stories, and it's certainly more accepting than many of the stories. The tone I find is generally positive while realising the realities of the world. Again, we see in this story the sparse dialogue and a sense of lack of action. The action's very quick and spontaneous in many ways, like nature is. We certainly get the anecdote, and the anecdote in this story is the anecdote of the cousin and how he dies, how he goes and gets drunk and falls off and blah blah, all that long story. And that's sort of interspersed within it to give it that feel that McLeod has in his stories, and I think that's important to note, and you can relate that of course to the other stories. The childlike views in the story is important, but he sees the practicalities of the adults. He seems to understand the adult world quite well. Of course, not so much seeing this story, but of course we do get that little scene at the end where she gives birth, but we certainly get that wonderful McLeod engagement with the natural world, with the cycles and transitions that he has in all the stories. Finally, I'd like to point out that all these stories in many ways can be bound together with the idea that it's about a small local area, but the individuals and their reactions to the intrusions of the global and the outside world, if you like, certainly the responses that they have are universal and can be applied to any sense or any situation, and the idea of being able to change and the ability to adapt and the ability to move on in life and accept and all those sorts of things is very important, and I think that's where McLeod engages us. Well, that's all we have time for on Second Spring. I hope you've enjoyed that. There's a few tips in there, of course, for any sort of essay or exam you're doing. Don't forget, press the like button, visit our website, subscribe to my site. Of course, we'll be looking at other texts as we move along. When you subscribe, you get all the details, and don't forget the Facebook page and to visit our website. Thanks for your time.